In the windowless corridors of the Pentagon, a document is circulating right now that marks the formal end of the American century. Most might think the recent tensions in the Middle East are about religion, or old grudges, or even a nuclear bomb. They are wrong. Washington just realized it can no longer starve Iran into submission, and that realization has triggered a desperate act of kinetic foreclosure.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
Look, for decades, the global order was maintained through one thing: the dominance of the dollar. It was the U.S. financial nuclear weapon. If a country didn't comply with Western interests, the U.S. Treasury simply cut them off from the banks. Assets were frozen. It became impossible for that nation to buy bread or medicine on the open market. But by February 2026, that weapon became neutralized. Despite 1,500 new sanctions meant to bury the regime, Iran's economy didn't collapse, it evolved. While the mainstream news reported total isolation, Iran was actually seeing a 4.2% GDP growth. How? Because 85% of Iranian oil is now settled in digital yuan. The SWIFT system, the gatekeeper of the global financial world, is now irrelevant to Tehran's survival. Therefore, Washington found itself in what analysts call the credibility trap. If a nuclear Iran is a red line, but sanctions no longer work, there is only one language left to speak: kinetic force. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It is the cold, hard logic of a dying hegemony.
انشاءالله به توفیق الهی دشمن رو به زانو در خواهیم آورد.
The radical Iranian regime that wants to build atomic bombs to destroy anyone and everywhere in the world.
The prevailing wisdom was that global shifts happen slowly over decades, but the data in the Tehran briefing proves otherwise. A country cannot be starved if it has already joined the Eurasian fortress. Saturday, February 28th, 9:40 a.m. That was the moment the U.S. and Israel executed Operation Epic Fury.
This terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again. They can never have a nuclear weapon.
This wasn't a stealthy strike in the middle of the night. It was a daylight execution. They struck when the Iranian leadership was gathered. In exactly 30 seconds, 30 senior officials were wiped from the map. Names like Khamenei, Zavi, and Hani, the very pillars of the regime, were eliminated. But a strike of this magnitude does not happen in a vacuum. Israel provided the jets, the U.S. provided the tomahawks. Therefore, the retaliation was a mathematical certainty. And it wasn't just a military response aimed at soldiers, it was a systemic attack on the primary vulnerabilities of the Western alliance. Operation True Promise 4 didn't just hit military bases, it hit the heart of the global economy. Dubai International, Terminal 3, dark. The Burj Al Arab, on fire. But the real damage isn't found in the rubble or the smoke. It is found in the maritime insurance system. The moment the Gulf is declared a war zone, insurance for oil tankers ceases to exist. Think about that. No insurance means no ships. No ships means Brent crude hits $150 in a single afternoon. Therefore, the strike in Tehran is merely the first domino in a kinetic butterfly effect. A missile in Iran triggers a sovereign default in South America, a banking collapse in the EU, a total fracture of the global supply chain. The world isn't just watching a war, it is watching systemic impotence. When the spreadsheets of the Treasury Department can no longer command the globe, the missiles of the Pentagon become the only argument left. History is very clear about one thing. Old orders don't just step aside politely, they are pushed. And Washington apparently decided to burn the board rather than lose the game. Now, observers are asking, what does this mean for the average bank account? What does this mean for the price of gas next week? The answer is uncomfortable. The world is moving into an era where value isn't determined by a digital entry in a New York bank. It's determined by who has the oil, who has the grain, and who has the missiles to protect them. The Tehran briefing wasn't just a military plan, it was a confession. It was the moment the West admitted that the era of economic coercion is dead. The world has entered the era of the kinetic reset. This is the end of the sanctions era and the beginning of the impact era. Every time a politician talks about defending democracy or enforcing international law in the coming months, remember that windowless corridor in the Pentagon. Remember the credibility trap. Because once the dollar loses its teeth, the only thing left to watch for is the bite. And based on the events of February 28th, that bite is going to be devastating for every nation tied to the old system. The board is burning. The question is, what is the individual doing to protect themselves before the smoke reaches their own front door? The Tehran briefing confirms that the rules of the last 80 years have been deleted. A new map is being drawn in real time. It is being drawn with fire, and there is no going back to the way things were. The strategy is no longer about winning, it's about surviving the fallout of a kinetic foreclosure. The world is watching, and the world is realizing. The old guard would rather see the system collapse than see it shared. That is the reality of the Tehran briefing. That's the cost of the credibility trap, and it's a cost that will be paid by every consumer, every driver, and every saver in the Western world.